At 43,000 feet, where the air grows thin enough to kill an unprotected man in seconds, a British fighter climbs effortlessly toward the stratosphere. Its 5-blade propeller claws through atmosphere that would stall most aircraft of its era. The engine behind that propeller displaces 36.7 litres and produces over 2,000 horsepower on emergency power. The aircraft can reach 446 miles per hour in level flight and climb faster than anything the Luftwaffe has ever encountered. This is the Supermarine Spitfire Mark XIV, the Griffon-powered variant that dominated every opponent it faced in the skies over Europe during the final year of the Second World War. In the war's final months, one squadron flying this aircraft claimed 33 aerial victories in 23 days without losing a single pilot to enemy action. The kill ratio was not merely favourable, it was absolute. Yet today, most people have never heard of it. They know the P-51 Mustang, the long-legged escort fighter that shepherded bombers to Berlin and back. They know the earlier Merlin Spitfires from the Battle of Britain, the aircraft that saved a nation in its darkest hour. But the machine that Captain Eric Brown, who flew more types than any pilot in history, ranked among the top 2 single-engine fighters of the entire war, remains largely forgotten by the general public. This is the story of an engineering masterpiece that history almost overlooked, and why its absence from popular memory says as much about how we remember wars as it does about the aircraft itself. To understand why the Spitfire Mark XIV faded from collective memory, we must first understand why the P-51 Mustang became legendary. The Mustang earned its immortal status for one overwhelming reason, and that reason was not performance in a dogfight. It was range. By late 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign over Germany was failing catastrophically. Heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force flew unescorted into the heart of the Reich, and they paid for it with blood. The 8th Air Force suffered a 77% overall casualty rate during its first 2 years of operations. The numbers were unsustainable. Bombers flying beyond the range of their fighter escorts were being systematically destroyed by Luftwaffe interceptors, who waited patiently beyond the point where the short-legged Spitfires and Thunderbolts had to turn back for lack of fuel. The crisis demanded a solution, and that solution arrived in the form of the Merlin-powered P-51B Mustang. With internal fuel tanks and drop tanks, it could fly to Berlin and back, a round trip exceeding 1,600 miles. No other single-engine fighter could match this capability. By the end of 1944, 14 of 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force flew Mustangs. The National World War II Museum frames the entire air war as having 2 distinct phases, pre-Mustang and post-Mustang. This narrative is not wrong. The Mustang's strategic impact was genuinely decisive in breaking the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich, but it created a blind spot in how we remember fighter aircraft from that era, a blind spot that obscured machines designed for a different mission entirely. The Spitfire Mark XIV was one such machine. The Rolls-Royce Griffon engine traces its lineage to one of the most remarkable racing powerplants ever built. The legendary R engine powered Supermarine's S-6B seaplane to Schneider Trophy, victory in 1931, at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. That racing machine, designed by Reginald Mitchell before he created the Spitfire, proved that enormous power could be packaged into an aircraft engine. The R engine displaced over 2,000 cubic inches from a 60-degree V12 configuration, numbers that would define the Griffon's architecture a decade later. But racing engines and military engines serve different masters. The R engine was designed to run flat out for short periods. A military engine must deliver power reliably for hundreds of hours, must be manufacturable in quantity, and must be maintainable under field conditions. The Griffon's true development as a military power plant began in 1938, when the Fleet Air Arm requested a larger alternative to the Merlin for naval aircraft. The Navy wanted good low-altitude power for anti-shipping strikes, reliability for operations far from land bases, and easy maintenance for work on carrier decks. Design work started under Harry Cantrell at Rolls-Royce's Derby factory. The engineering challenge was immense. Creating a new aero engine from scratch requires years of development, testing, and refinement. Every component must be designed, prototyped, tested to destruction, redesigned, and tested again. On the 30th of November, 1939, the first prototype Griffon ran for the first time in the experimental department at Derby. The engine worked, but working and being ready for production are very different things. Just 4 days later, Supermarine issued Specification 466, exploring how to fit this bigger engine into the Spitfire airframe. Joseph Smith, who had succeeded R.J. Mitchell as Supermarine's chief designer after Mitchell's death from cancer in June 1937, championed the concept of a Griffon Spitfire. Mitchell had died at 42, having seen his masterpiece fly but not having seen it go to war. Smith would carry the Spitfire through the entire conflict, developing it from a pre-war design into the most evolved piston-engine fighter of the era. Ernest Hives, Rolls-Royce's senior executive, endorsed the program enthusiastically. He called the Griffon a second power string for the Spitfire, insurance against the day when the Merlin could be developed no further. Then came a critical setback that nearly killed the Griffon program entirely. In May 1940, Lord Beaverbrook became Minister of Aircraft Production. Britain faced invasion. Every resource had to be concentrated on immediate needs. Beaverbrook ordered all Griffon work halted to concentrate resources on Merlin production for the desperate Battle of Britain. From his perspective, the decision made sense. The Merlin worked. The Griffon was still experimental. Britain needed fighters now, not in 2 years. But the order cost the Griffon program precious months of momentum. Development work froze while Spitfires and Hurricanes fought overhead. Work resumed only after the immediate crisis passed and the Battle of Britain was won. Engineers returned to the Griffon project, but they had lost irreplaceable time. The first Griffon-powered Spitfire prototype, designated DP-845 and initially called the Mark IV before being redesignated. Mark XX flew on the 27th of November 1941. Geoffrey Quill, Supermarine's chief test pilot, was at the controls. Quill had flown every Spitfire variant and would continue to fly every new Mark until the end of the war. His assessment of DP-845 was cautious but optimistic. The concept was sound, but transforming the prototype into an operational fighter would require solving problems that challenged the best engineering minds in British aviation. Fitting the Griffon 65 into the Spitfire airframe was anything but straightforward. The Spitfire had been designed around the Merlin, and while both engines shared a V12 configuration and many design philosophies, the Griffon was a substantially larger power plant. The engine was roughly 12 inches longer than the Merlin, forcing engineers to extend the nose by about 10 inches and completely reposition the oil tank from its original location in the lower cowling to a new position forward of the fuselage fuel tanks. The engine sat 10 inches further forward than earlier Griffon installations in the Mark XII, with the top section of the engine bulkhead angled forward to accommodate the two-stage supercharger housing. This created the Mark XIV's distinctive change of angle at the upper cowling's rear edge, a visual signature that distinguished it from all other Spitfire variants. Main longerons were strengthened to cope with greater torsional loads. The aircraft's total length grew to 32 feet 8 inches, compared to 29 feet 11 inches for early Merlin Spitfires. The most dangerous challenge facing the engineers was torque. The Griffon produced massive rotational force at takeoff power, and critically, its propeller rotated in the opposite direction to the Merlin's. This was not an arbitrary choice. The Griffon's opposite rotation was dictated by engineering requirements related to supercharger operation and accessory drive arrangements, but it created a deadly trap for pilots. Where Merlin Spitfires swung left on takeoff, requiring right rudder correction, Griffon Spitfires swung violently right, requiring full left rudder and left aileron. Pilots transitioning from Merlin variants often applied the wrong correction from muscle memory, instinctively pushing right rudder when they needed left. This caused accidents, some of them fatal. A modern warbird pilot described the experience of taking off in a Griffon Spitfire in Smithsonian Air and Space magazine. His account captures what pilots of the 1940s faced every time they opened the throttle. Throttle up slowly to prevent a lurch to the right. Monster torque shoves the right wing down rapidly. There is so much raw power and noise, and you are so tightly focused on keeping everything under control, the actual liftoff at around 90 knots goes by almost unnoticed. This was the reality of flying a 2,000 horsepower fighter designed before the jet age. To absorb the Griffon 65's enormous power output, a new 5-blade Rotol constant speed propeller of 10 feet 5 inches diameter was required. This became the most visible recognition feature distinguishing the Mark XIV from its Merlin stablemates. From any angle, the 5-blade propeller identified the aircraft as a Griffon Spitfire. The Rotol Company, a joint venture between Rolls-Royce and Bristol, developed this unit specifically for the application. The propeller alone represented a significant engineering achievement, as blades had to be designed to efficiently convert power to thrust at speeds approaching the sound barrier at their tips. A taller, broader fin and rudder of increased area was fitted to counteract the torque and slipstream effects that made the aircraft directionally unstable. Even with these modifications, the Airfighting Development Unit noted that the Mark XIV needed more frequent trimming than the Mark IX during combat maneuvers. The elevator control was much heavier than that of the Spitfire VIII, unpleasantly so according to the official report. The stall arrived more suddenly than in earlier Marks, giving pilots less warning before the aircraft departed controlled flight. Geoffrey Quill, upon first flying the prototype, realized at once that they would have to correct its directional characteristics, and probably its longitudinal stability also. 2 degrees of engine downthrust were incorporated to help reduce the torque effects, with the entire engine installation angled slightly nose down relative to the fuselage. Despite these handling quirks, Quill's final verdict on the Mark XIV was unequivocal. The Mark XIV was in business, and a very fine fighter it was. It fully justified the faith of those who, from the early days in 1939, had been convinced that the Griffon engine would eventually see the Spitfire into a new lease of life. It was a splendid aeroplane in every respect. Coming from the man who had flown more Spitfires than anyone else alive, this was the highest possible endorsement. The key engineers who made the Griffon Spitfire possible deserve recognition that they rarely receive. Arthur Rubra joined Rolls-Royce on the 13th of July 1925 and rose through the ranks to become chief designer of aero engines in July 1940. He oversaw the Griffon's development throughout the war, balancing the competing demands of performance, reliability, and production. Rubra would later help develop the jet engines that made piston fighters obsolete. Cyril Lovesey was even more central to the effort, though his name is known only to specialists. He was in charge of the entire Merlin development program from 1939 to 1945, and his work on supercharger development directly benefited the Griffon. His insight that the output of the engine depends solely on the mass of air it can be made to consume efficiently drove the creation of the two-stage, two-speed supercharger that transformed the Griffon from a low-altitude brute into a high-altitude champion. Without Lovesey's supercharger work, the Mark XIV could never have achieved its remarkable performance at altitude. Lovesey later headed the Rolls-Royce Avon jet engine design team, continuing to shape British aviation into the jet age. In 1971, he was brought back out of retirement to help resolve the RB211 turbofan crisis that nearly bankrupted Rolls-Royce. The Griffon 65, with its two-stage supercharger and water-air intercooler, could produce 2,035 horsepower at 7,000 feet in medium-speed gear and 1,820 horsepower at 21,000 feet in full-speed gear. The 2,050 horsepower figure, commonly cited, represents emergency maximum power at plus 18 pounds boost, a 5-minute limit rating intended for combat emergencies only. Exceeding this limit risked engine damage, with 150-octane fuel, which became available from late 1944, output soared to 2,220 horsepower. The Griffon displaced 36.7 litres, 36% larger than the 27-litre Merlin, yet its frontal area was only marginally bigger at 7.9 versus 7.5 square feet, a testament to clever packaging that minimized aerodynamic drag. The Airfighting Development Unit conducted comprehensive tactical trials of the Spitfire XIV using aircraft RB179 in early 1944. The unit was based at RAF Wittering, and their test pilots were experienced combat veterans who understood what mattered in a dogfight. These AFDU reports are primary source documents, not second-hand accounts or post-war recollections. Their findings remain authoritative for anyone seeking to understand what the Mark XIV could actually do. Against the Focke-Wulf 190A, the dominant German radial engine fighter of the period, the Mark XIV was dominant at all altitudes. At low and medium altitudes up to 20,000 feet, the Spitfire held a 20-mile-per-hour speed advantage. Above 20,000 feet, this advantage widened to 60 miles per hour as the Focke-Wulf's single-stage supercharger ran out of breath in the thin air. The Mark XIV enjoyed a considerably faster rate of climb at all altitudes. In a turning fight, the Spitfire could outturn the Focke-Wulf. The German aircraft retained only its advantages in roll rate and initial dive acceleration. The AFDU advised that if attacked by a Focke-Wulf 190, the Mark XIV pilot should exploit its fast maximum climb and turning circle to escape and reposition for attack. Against the Messerschmitt 109G, the latest version of the aircraft that had fought the Battle of Britain, the Mark XIV was faster at all heights and outclimbed it at most altitudes. Rates of climb between the two aircraft equalized only around 16,000 feet, a narrow band where the Messerschmitt's lighter weight briefly compensated for its lower power. The Spitfire retained its traditional turning advantage that had defined Spitfire versus 109 combat since 1940. Against the Mustang III, the British equivalent designation for the P-51 B and C models broadly comparable to the P-51D, the AFDU comparison was nuanced and revealing. These were not aircraft that would meet as enemies, but the comparison illuminated their different design philosophies. On maximum speed, the two aircraft were practically identical, with neither holding a meaningful advantage. On climb, the Spitfire 14 was very much better. On turning circle, the Spitfire 14 was better. On rate of roll, the advantage tended to be with the Spitfire 14. In a dive, the Mustang pulled away, its laminar flow wing designed for high-speed flight, but less markedly than against the earlier Mark IX. On range, without a long-range tank, the Spitfire 14 had no endurance worth mentioning. With a 90-gallon long-range tank, it had about half the range of the Mustang III. The AFDU conclusion deserves to be quoted directly. With the exception of endurance, no conclusions can be drawn, as these two aircraft should never be enemies. The choice is a matter of taste. This official assessment captures something important. These were different tools designed for different jobs. Comparing them as if one was objectively better than the other misses the point of why both existed. The numbers tell the comparative story starkly. The Mark XIV climbed at approximately 4,500 feet per minute against the P-51D's 3,200 to 3,475 feet per minute. Its service ceiling reached 43,000 feet versus the Mustang's 41,600 feet. But internal fuel capacity was just 109.5 imperial gallons against the P-51D's 269 US gallons. The Mark XIV's combat radius barely exceeded 460 miles on internal fuel. The Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin and back, over 1,650 miles with drop tanks. These were complementary aircraft designed for fundamentally different missions in the same war. Captain Eric Brown flew 487 aircraft types during his career, a feat recognized by Guinness World Records as unmatched in aviation history. His roster included everything from fabric-covered biplanes to experimental jets, from captured enemy aircraft to Allied prototypes. He flew 14 marks of Spitfire and Seafire, giving him unparalleled comparative experience. In his book Duels in the Sky, published in 1988, Brown ranked the Spitfire 14 and the Focke-Wulf 190D9 as the top two single-engine fighters from the European theatre. He later stated that had the Spitfire not been matched by the phenomenal roll rate of the long-nose Focke-Wulf, it would have been the clear winner. Separately, Brown indicated he personally found the Griffon-powered Mark XII the most enjoyable Spitfire variant to fly for its handling qualities, and that overall he favoured the de Havilland Hornet, a twin-engine design, among all piston-engine aircraft. His views were genuinely nuanced and context-dependent, resisting the simple hierarchies that enthusiasts prefer. On the 31st of December 1944, a flight of 610 Squadron Spitfire 14s was mistakenly bounced by United States Army Air Force P-51 Mustangs. The American pilots, presumably having misidentified the Spitfires, attacked with altitude and speed advantage. Using the Spitfire's stunning climb performance, the British pilots easily escaped and evaded the Mustangs, climbing away faster than the Americans could follow. No shots were exchanged once the mistake became apparent. This unplanned encounter served as real-world validation of the AFDU data showing the Mark XIV's superiority in the climb. The Spitfire Mark XIV's first great operational test came not against the Luftwaffe's fighters but against its unmanned weapons. When Germany began launching V-1 flying bombs at England in June 1944, the RAF scrambled to organize defenses against a threat unlike any faced before. The V-1 was a pulse jet-powered cruise missile carrying an 1,800-pound warhead. It flew at approximately 400 miles per hour, at around 1,000 feet, a combination of low altitude and high speed that made interception extremely difficult. Most Allied fighters could not catch a V-1-inch level flight at that altitude. Those that could often struggled to destroy the small, fast-moving target before it reached London. The Griffon-powered Spitfire XIV was one of the very few aircraft fast enough to reliably catch V-1s. With 150-octane fuel enabling 400 miles per hour at 2,000 feet, the Mark XIV could overhaul the flying bombs from astern. 7 Spitfire XIV squadrons joined the anti-diver campaign, diver being the British codename for V-1 defence operations. Number 91, Nigeria Squadron, based at RAF West Malling in Kent, became the most successful V-1 killing unit among Spitfire squadrons, destroying 184 V-1 flying bombs between June and September 1944. This total was exceeded only by 2 Hawker Tempest squadrons, whose aircraft were slightly faster at low altitude. The first Mark XIV V-1 kill came on the 16th of June 1944, when Flight Lieutenant H. Moffat of 91 Squadron destroyed 1 over Kenley, Surrey, after a 20-mile chase. Across all Mark XIV units, approximately 250 to 300 V-1s were destroyed, with sources varying on the exact count depending on how shared kills and unconfirmed claims are tallied. The tactics were brutal and dangerous. Pilots would climb above the V-1, dive to attack from astern, and open fire within 200 yards. The approach had to be precise because the V-1 was a small target moving at high speed. Worse, if cannon rounds struck the warhead, the resulting explosion could destroy the attacking fighter. Several pilots were killed or injured by debris from V-1s they successfully intercepted. When ammunition ran out or guns jammed, pilots developed the extraordinary wingtip tipping technique. This involved flying alongside the V-1, matching its speed precisely, and positioning their wingtip just below the V-1's wing. A gentle roll would disrupt the flying bomb's gyroscope, the device that kept it flying straight and level. Without gyroscopic stabilization, the V-1 would spiral out of control and crash into open countryside rather than continuing to London. The technique required precise flying and steady nerves, as any contact with the V-1's body could damage the fighter. Australian flying officer Kenneth Collier of 91 Squadron performed the first recorded wingtip tipping on the 23rd of June 1944, flying Spitfire 14NH-698. The squadron diary recorded the event with characteristic British understatement. He therefore formatted with it, and with his wing tipped it over. On his second attempt, down it went in a tight spin, but it very nearly landed in the centre of East Grinstead. The casual tone masks the skill and courage required. Collier was credited with 7 V-1 kills during the campaign. He was killed on the 5th of December 1944, shot down by enemy fighters over Skolven, Germany, while flying a Spitfire 9 on escort duty. His remains were discovered on the 29th of June 1949 by the No. 4 Missing Research and Inquiry Unit at a mineworks in Scholven. He is buried at Rheinberg War Cemetery. The most heroic V-1 engagement belonged to Flight Lieutenant Jean Maridor, a free French pilot serving with 91 Squadron. On the 3rd of August 1944, Maridor intercepted a V-1 heading directly for Benenden School in Kent. The school had been evacuated of students, but was serving as a military hospital with a large red cross painted on its roof. Inside were tuberculosis patients who could not be quickly moved. After multiple firing passes failed to bring the bomb down, either because of ammunition problems or insufficient hits on the small target, Maridor closed to within 50 meters for a final burst. At that range, his cannon rounds could not miss. They struck the V-1's warhead. The explosion tore the right wing off his Spitfire. He was killed instantly, but the bomb never reached the hospital. Jean Maridor was 23 years old. He was 8 days from his wedding to WAAF Section Officer Jean Lambourne, scheduled for the 11th of August. He had previously destroyed 10 V-1s and scored 5 aerial victories against manned aircraft. He was posthumously awarded the DFC and the Légion d'honneur. Benenden School's own historical records confirm this event and honour his sacrifice to this day. After the V-1 campaign ended in September 1944 with the Allied capture of the launch sites, Spitfire 14 squadrons transferred from Air Defence of Great Britain to the 2nd Tactical Air Force. They moved to the continent to support the Allied advance into Germany. Numbers 41, 130, 350, Belgian, 402, Royal Canadian Air Force, and 610 squadrons formed number 125 Wing, operating from bases in Belgium and the Netherlands as the front moved eastward. During the Battle of the Bulge period from December 1944 through January 1945, these squadrons flew armed reconnaissance missions, attacking road, rail, and canal targets behind German lines to interdict supplies and reinforcements. Flak was the primary threat, as German anti-aircraft defences remained formidable, but aerial combat was intense when it occurred, as Luftwaffe fighters rose to challenge the attackers. On the 8th of December 1944, 10 Mark XIVs of No. 130 Squadron were bounced by approximately 20 Messerschmitt 109Gs and Focke-Wulf 190s in the Munster area while attacking a train. Despite being outnumbered 2-1, the Spitfires fought back effectively. The result was 3 enemy destroyed, 2 probables, for the loss of 1 Spitfire. Flight Lieutenant Donald Wilson of the Royal Australian Air Force was shot down in Spitfire 14 RM749 and subsequently murdered near Rain Airfield after parachuting safely, a documented war crime that would be prosecuted after the war. Flight Lieutenant Harold Walmsley scored his 3rd kill in this engagement. Walmsley was an Englishman from Preston, Lancashire, who had trained as a pilot in Rhodesia before joining 130 Punjab Squadron. He later reported that the Spitfire 14 was definitely better than the Messerschmitt 109, as I could do a better climbing turn even with my external fuel tank on, and this prevented him from getting a deflection shot on me. This testimony from actual combat confirms what the AFDU trials had established. The Mark XIV could outperform the Messerschmitt even when carrying the extra weight and drag of external fuel tanks. On the 1st of January 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise mass attack by approximately 850 fighters against Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. The operation was conceived as a decisive blow to destroy Allied tactical air power on the ground. Elements of Jagdgeschwader 4 struck the 125 Wing airfield at Offerven, designated Y-32 in Allied terminology. The attack destroyed 2 Spitfires and damaged 10. The damage was relatively minor compared to the devastation inflicted at other bases, where entire squadrons were wiped out. The Luftwaffe paid catastrophically for Bodenplatte. 213 fighter pilots were killed, missing, or captured, including over 60 experienced pilots and 22 formation leaders, such as Geschwaderkommandeur, Gruppenkommandeur, and Staffelkapitän. These were losses that could not be replaced. The day fighter force had gambled everything on a single throw and lost. It was a blow from which German fighter forces never recovered, leaving them unable to contest Allied air superiority during the final 4 months of the war. In the war's final weeks, the Mark XIV demonstrated what it could achieve when conditions favoured its strengths and experienced pilots faced weakened opposition. On the 23rd of January 1945, Squadron leader Douglas Benham of No. 41 Squadron led an engagement against Focke-Wulf 190D9s, the Luftwaffe's formidable long-nose variant powered by the Junkers Jumo 213 liquid-cooled engine. Benham personally destroyed 2 of the enemy aircraft while flying Spitfire 14R M791. A third one, 90D, was credited to Flying Officer Hegarty. These were among the first Mark XIV air-to-air victories scored during continental operations. On the 2nd of March 1945, Spitfire 14s of 350 Belgian and 130 squadrons swept against Messerschmitt 109K4s and Focke-Wulf 190D9s near the Rhine. Despite being outnumbered, 350 squadrons' 7 Spitfire 14s claimed 3 Messerschmitt 109Ks destroyed plus 1 damaged. The Belgian pilots, flying British aircraft, demonstrated the same superiority that British and Commonwealth pilots had established. The Mark XIV also engaged German jets in the war's final weeks. No. 41 Squadron intercepted an Arado AR-234 jet bomber near Bremen on the 12th of April, 1945. The twin jet reconnaissance bomber was fast, but the Mark XIV pilots caught it and destroyed it. On the 25th of April, they chased two Messerschmitt 262s to Lübeck, claiming one destroyed. Against the Messerschmitt 262, the Spitfire could not match speeds, but tactical positioning and pilot skill could still achieve results. Number 414 Squadron of the Royal Canadian Air Force, operating FR Mark XIVs in the fighter reconnaissance role, scored 29 aerial victories between the squadron receiving its Mark XIVs in early April and VE Day. The camera-equipped aircraft proved just as deadly as their pure fighter counterparts when enemy aircraft attempted to interfere with reconnaissance missions. In the war's final 5 weeks, from the 1st of April through the 8th of May 1945, Mark XIV units collectively amassed approximately 90 aerial victories, according to detailed analysis by aviation historians. Number 41, Squadron's record was staggering. 33 enemy aircraft destroyed, 2 probables, 3 damaged, plus 21 destroyed on the ground, all in 23 days, with 0 pilots killed or wounded, and 0 aircraft lost to enemy action. This was air supremacy achieved through superior equipment and skilled pilots facing depleted opposition. Over its entire operational career from January 1944 through VE Day, the Spitfire Mark XIV recorded approximately 154 confirmed aerial victories against manned aircraft. According to a comprehensive analysis published by the aviation research site Hushkit in November 2023, 90 of these victories came in the war's final 5 weeks. This figure represents around 0.17 victories per airframe built, a kill ratio that compared favorably to any Allied fighter of the period. Losses came primarily from flak and accidents, rather than enemy fighters. The pilots who flew the Mark XIV left testimonies that illuminate why the aircraft inspired such confidence. Flight Lieutenant Harold Walmsley emerged as one of the Mark XIV's most prolific combat pilots, scoring 9 1/4 victories on the type with 130 Punjab Squadron. His observation that the Spitfire 14 could outclimb the Messerschmitt, even while carrying drop tanks, remains one of the most revealing first-hand assessments of the aircraft's combat superiority. Flight Lieutenant Ian Ponsford of 130 Squadron scored 7 victories on the Mark XIV, with 6 coming in the final 11 days of April 1945. His assessment of the aircraft was emphatic. The Spitfire 14 was the most marvelous aeroplane at that time, and I consider it to have been the best operational fighter of them all, as it could outclimb virtually anything. Wing Commander Colin Gray held the distinction of being New Zealand's highest-scoring ace, with 27 solo victories plus 2 shared. He was awarded the DSO and DFC with 2 bars. Gray commanded the Limpner Wing, equipped with Spitfire 14s, from August 1944 to January 1945, when he departed for a senior commander's course at RAF Cranwell. His personal aircraft was Mark XIV ERM 787, marked with his initials CG. Though he scored no additional kills during this assignment, having achieved his victories on earlier Spitfire marks, his leadership shaped the Mark XIV's transition from home defense to continental operations. Group Captain James Edgar Johnnie Johnson remains the RAF's officially recognized top-scoring fighter ace with 38 confirmed victories. He held the DSO with 2 bars and DFC with bar. Johnson was promoted to Group Captain on the 26th of March 1945 at Twente and took command of No. 125 Wing days later. He flew Spitfire F Mark XIV-E aircraft MV-268 during the final weeks of the war, marked with his initials JEJ. After VE Day, he flew MV-257 during occupation duties in Denmark. Never shot down in his entire career and hit only once by enemy fire, Johnson led the wing through the war's final weeks. His 38 victories were scored primarily on Mark IXs earlier in the war, but his decision to fly the Mark XIV as wing leader speaks to his confidence in the type. German assessments of the Spitfire present an interesting historical puzzle that documentary makers should approach carefully. There is a quote, widely attributed to General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's Inspector General of Fighters. The best thing about the Spitfire 14 was that there were so few of them. This quote appears in numerous secondary sources, including Andrew Thomas's Griffon Spitfire Aces, published by Osprey in 2008. However, documentary evidence for this attribution remains elusive despite extensive research. Aviation historians investigating the quote have been unable to locate it in any primary source, including Gallen's autobiography, The First and the Last, or any verified interview transcript. Some researchers believe the quote may have originally referred to the Hawker Tempest rather than the Mark XIV. The sentiment captures a truth about the Mark XIV's limited numbers and formidable capability, but the attribution to Galland cannot be verified and should not be presented as fact. More reliably documented is the general Luftwaffe respect for the Spitfire as a type across all its variants. Author Jerry Skutz, in his book on Jagdgeschwader 54, quotes German pilots as having developed a particular aversion to Spitfires. He adds that pilot reflections do not, surprisingly enough, reflect overmuch respect for the Mustang or Lightning, both of which the Germans reckoned their Fokkes were equal to unless they were met in superior numbers. This suggests that among fighter versus fighter pilots, the Spitfire commanded more individual respect than the Mustang, even though the Mustang's strategic impact through its range was decisive in winning the air war. All 957 Mark XIVs were built by Vickers Armstrong Supermarine at dispersed shadow factories around southern England. These sites included Aldermaston in Berkshire, Chattis Hill, Keevil at RAF Keevil, Winchester, and workshops around Southampton, Salisbury and Trowbridge. Notably, the famous Castle Bromwich factory did not produce the Mark XIV. Castle Bromwich continued with Mark IX and 16 Spitfires exclusively, maintaining the high-volume production of Merlin-powered variants that the RAF needed in quantity. Completed Mark XIV airframes were transported by Queen Mary low-loader trailers to satellite airfields for final assembly and flight testing under Geoffrey Quill's oversight. The first production aircraft, serial RB140, flew in October 1943. Geoffrey Quill Test flew it that month, though it was not delivered to the RAF until the 20th of December 1943. Production comprised approximately 527 F Mark XIV fighters and 430 FR Mark XIV fighter reconnaissance variants. Sub-variants evolved through the production run as improvements were incorporated. Early aircraft had the C-type universal wing, with two 20mm Hispano cannon plus 4.303 Browning machine guns, fitted with a high-back fuselage and Malcolm Hood canopy. Later aircraft received the E-type wing with two 20mm Hispano plus 2.50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns, and many featured the cut-down rear fuselage with a bubble teardrop canopy that became standard on late-war fighters. Number 6, 10 County of Chester Squadron, received the first 8 Mark XIVs at RAF Exeter on the 6th of January 1944, becoming the first operational unit. The squadron had begun receiving aircraft in December 1943 and became operationally declared around the 8th of January. The primary production bottleneck that limited Mark XIV numbers was Griffon engine supply. Beaverbrook's 1940 halt on Griffon work created a development gap that was never fully closed. By 1943, massive economies of scale existed for the Merlin, which simultaneously powered Lancasters, Mosquitoes, Hurricanes, and Spitfire 9s. The RAF strategically chose to maintain high-volume Mark 9 and 16 production, totaling 6,710 aircraft, alongside limited Mark 14 output. The Mark 14 was always considered an interim design, pending the more refined Mark 18. But delays with the 18 made the 14 the definitive wartime Griffon Spitfire. Post-war, surplus Mark XIVs found new homes with Allied air forces. The Royal Belgian Air Force received 132 aircraft. The Royal Indian Air Force took 70 aircraft for service in the subcontinent. The Royal Thai Air Force acquired 30 FR Mark XIVs. The P-51 Mustang's dominance in popular memory stems from capabilities the Spitfire could never match. Range transformed the air war over Europe by making deep escort possible. No amount of climb rate or turn performance could substitute for the ability to protect bombers all the way to their targets and back. Industrial scale compounded the narrative gap. North American aviation produced roughly 15,500 Mustangs of all variants across multiple factories. Supermarine built 957 Mark XIVs. American post-war media, from Hollywood films to publishing to television and later video games, disproportionately celebrated the P-51. The Mustang served in the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, extending its operational fame into a new conflict. Surplus P-51s flooded American civilian aviation, dominating air races and filling museums, where they became the iconic World War II fighter for generations of Americans. The Spitfire's global fame remained anchored to the Battle of Britain, fought by Merlin-powered Mark I's and IIs in 1940. That desperate summer defined the Spitfire in public consciousness, but it occurred 4 years before the Griffon variants entered service. Even within Spitfire history, the Griffon marks were overshadowed. The Merlin's distinctive high-pitched singing exhaust note became iconic, recognized worldwide. The Griffon's deeper growl, though emanating from a more powerful engine, was less recognizable. The Mark XIV arrived when the narrative was already set. It fought in roles that were essential but less glamorous than the Battle of Britain or escort missions to Berlin. One interception saved lives but made poor cinema. Armed reconnaissance won no headlines. What does the Spitfire Mark XIV's obscurity teach us about how we remember wars? The P-51 Mustang broke the Luftwaffe's spine by making deep escort possible, a role the Spitfire could never fill because of its fundamental design as a short-range interceptor. Production economics, American industrial might, and the cultural machinery of a rising superpower ensured the Mustang's story would be told louder and more often in the decades that followed. The Griffon Spitfire's contributions, stopping the V-1 terror campaign, achieving total air dominance over the collapsing Reich, providing the tactical reconnaissance that guided armies to victory, were real but less cinematically compelling than shepherding bomber formations to Berlin. Strategy determines wars. Tactics win battles. The Mark XIV was the supreme tactical instrument, built for a different purpose than the Mustang, and superbly suited to that purpose. Its pilots achieved kill ratios that bordered on the absurd against late-war Luftwaffe opposition. Its climb rate remained unmatched by any operational piston-engine fighter in the European theatre. What remains beyond dispute is the engineering achievement. From a racing engine lineage through wartime improvisation to a 2,000-plus horsepower masterpiece, turning a 5-blade propeller, the Griffon Spitfire combination represented the absolute pinnacle of piston-engine fighter design. The engineers at Rolls-Royce and Supermarine, men like Arthur Rubbra and Cyril Lovesey and Joseph Smith, created something that pushed the limits of what internal combustion power could achieve in an airframe conceived in the 1930s. Only 957 Mark XIVs were built. That scarcity, the very thing that limited its strategic impact, is also what makes its story worth telling now. Every aircraft that survives today represents one of fewer than 1,000. Every pilot account comes from a pool measured in hundreds rather than thousands. The Mark XIV exists at the intersection of excellence and obscurity, a machine that was measurably superior to its more famous rival in nearly every dogfighting parameter, yet one that faded from collective memory because it fought the wrong kind of war for the storytellers who came after. The question of whether the Mark XIV or the Mustang was the better aircraft ultimately depends on what you needed the aircraft to do. For escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, the Mustang had no rival. For achieving local air superiority over a battlefield, for intercepting fast targets, for the pure dogfight, the evidence suggests the Mark XIV was superior. Both aircraft were masterpieces of wartime engineering that fulfilled their intended roles brilliantly. The Spitfire Mark XIV deserved a better story. Now it finally has one. If you found value in this documentary, please consider subscribing to support continued aviation history content on this channel. Click the notification bell to be alerted when new documentaries are released. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which forgotten aircraft would you like to see covered next? Thank you for watching.